to the people,
Yeah.
than because they're the ones that create the image, whatever it might be,
Yeah.
And I'm getting older and have a.
On December 31st, 1985, New Year's Eve, while the entire United States was preparing to welcome the momentous arrival of the new year, a shocking piece of news spread across all newspapers like a thunderbolt. Ricky Nelson, an icon of rock and roll, a star who had once made millions of teenage hearts flutter, had tragically perished in a horrific plane crash. His private plane burst into flames in the skies over Texas, and none of the 7 individuals aboard survived. A brilliant career, a dazzling legacy, all ended in a fiery inferno. What shook the public even more were the mysteries surrounding his death. For years, countless chilling theories were woven. Was Ricky involved with drugs? Was there negligence by the flight crew? Or was there a darker conspiracy being concealed? People debated, people doubted, and Ricky Nelson's name was mentioned not only in connection to his music, but also tied to a lingering question mark over his untimely demise. And then, after decades of investigation, the truth was finally brought to light. Yet, it did not bring peace, nor did it offer any semblance of justice. On the contrary, it was harsh, cruel, and painful, leaving fans with hearts aching once more. So, what truly happened on that ill-fated flight? Why is the truth behind Ricky Nelson's death so grim? Join us as we uncover the answers to one of the most enigmatic tragedies in the history of American music. In the mid-20th century, when the raw energy of rock and roll began to shake the very foundations of popular culture, America found itself in need of new icons, faces and voices that could capture the restless spirit of youth. Elvis Presley may have lit the match, but he was not alone in fanning the flames. Rising from the golden glow of television screens and the crackle of transistor radios, a young man named Ricky Nelson stepped forward, quietly but powerfully shaping what it meant to be a teenage idol. Born Eric Hilliard. Nelson in 1940, Ricky grew up in a household already accustomed to the limelight. His parents, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, were beloved entertainers who welcomed their audience not just into theaters or onto radio waves, but eventually into their own home through the groundbreaking television series, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. It was in this unique cultural cradle that Ricky's career took root. Unlike many of his contemporaries who clawed their way into the spotlight, Ricky seemed to glide into it, destined in a way for fame. Yet what he did with that platform transformed him from a child actor into one of the most recognizable and influential young musicians of his era. When Ricky first strummed a guitar on national television, the reaction was immediate and electric. Viewers, especially young ones, saw someone who looked like them, a clean-cut teenager with an easy smile, living a life that seemed both relatable and aspirational. By the late 1950s, America was in the midst of a cultural upheaval. The old post-war order was being challenged by new attitudes, new fashions, and most significantly, new sounds. Rock and roll, with its mixture of rhythm, blues, and raw teenage rebellion, was the anthem of this generational shift. Ricky Nelson became one of its most recognizable voices. His first major hit, Poor Little Fool, did more than top the charts. It marked the beginning of a career that would see Nelson become one of the best-selling artists of the late 1950s and early 1960s. The single was the first #1 hit on Billboard's Hot 100, forever etching his name into the record books. But Ricky's artistry was not just a product of clever marketing or his family's television fame. His voice carried a gentle sincerity, a warmth that made him distinct from Presley's raw sensuality or Chuck Berry's electric energy. Nelson was the boy next door, the kind of star parents didn't mind their daughters swooning over. Yet his songs captured the same spirit of longing, freedom, and romance that defined the rock and roll generation. What made Ricky Nelson particularly groundbreaking was the way he bridged television and music. At a time when the two mediums were only beginning to converge, Nelson became a pioneer. Millions of viewers tuned in to Ozzie and Harriet every week, and many of them witnessed Ricky performing his songs for the first time in the living room of America's most famous fictional family. For teenagers, this was electrifying. Not only could they listen to their favorite artist on the radio, They could see him week after week in their own living rooms. This exposure didn't just launch Ricky's career, it changed the very way music was promoted and consumed. It created a model for future stars, from the Monkees to modern-day Disney Channel alumni, proving that television could be a launching pad for musical success. By the early 1960s, Ricky Nelson was no longer just a television novelty. With hits like Travelin' Man and Hello, Mary Lou, he established himself as a serious recording artist with international reach. Travelin' Man, in particular, captured the imagination of listeners with its dreamy lyrics about love affairs across the globe, paired with a melody that seemed tailor-made for summer nights and youthful daydreams. The song became an anthem for young Americans growing up in a world that was suddenly more connected, more adventurous, and more full of possibility. Nelson's good looks, smooth voice, and natural charm earned him comparisons to Elvis Presley, and for a time he was considered one of Elvis's few true rivals. Yet unlike Presley, who cultivated a persona of rebellion and sensuality, Ricky's appeal lay in his relatability. He wasn't threatening, he was approachable. For countless fans, he represented a safe but still thrilling version of rock and roll, one that parents could accept and teenagers could adore without fear of judgment. This unique positioning helped Ricky Nelson carve out a niche that was entirely his own. But beneath the wholesome image, Nelson was a serious artist. He surrounded himself with skilled musicians, absorbed influences from rockabilly, country, and folk, and pushed himself to grow beyond the confines of teen idol status. His career would later evolve toward country rock, influencing a new generation of musicians in the 1970s. In retrospect, his contributions to the development of American popular music are often underestimated, overshadowed by flashier contemporaries. Yet historians and critics alike acknowledge that Ricky Nelson helped lay the groundwork for genres that would flourish long after the first wave of rock and roll had subsided. More than 60 years later, Ricky Nelson remains a symbol of an era when popular culture was reinventing itself at breakneck speed. He embodied the innocence and optimism of 1950s America, while also hinting at the deeper complexities of the youth movement that was about to explode in the 1960s. Through his songs, his television appearances, and his enduring image, he offered teenagers not just entertainment but representation. A voice that seemed to understand their struggles and aspirations. If Ricky Nelson's music career painted him as the dream of America's youth, his personal life told a far more complicated story, one that revealed the heavy price of fame. For behind the perfect image of the clean-cut heartthrob, behind the carefully staged smiles on magazine covers, Ricky wrestled with the same struggles that so many ordinary people faced. Love that was passionate but fragile, family bonds that were both a blessing and a burden, and the gnawing loneliness that fame so often conceals. By the early 1960s, Ricky had already cemented his place as one of America's most beloved entertainers. His songs were climbing the charts, his appearances on television were must-watch events, and his face adorned the walls of teenage bedrooms across the country. It was during this period, in 1963, that he married Kristen Harmon, the daughter of football hero Tom Harmon and Hollywood actress Elise Knox. To the public, the marriage looked like a perfect union, a golden boy of rock and roll marrying into a family of American royalty. The press could hardly resist the narrative. Music's sweetheart, and Hollywood's daughter, walking hand in hand into a fairy tale future. The wedding itself was described as a glittering spectacle. Imagine a balmy California afternoon, the air scented with roses and a line of photographers capturing every moment as if it were a royal coronation. Guests from the worlds of sports, cinema, and music mingled under chandeliers, raising their glasses to the promise of everlasting love. For a while, it seemed as though Ricky and Kristen had everything: youth, beauty, talent, and the kind of glamour that Hollywood itself was built upon. Their family grew quickly. The couple welcomed 4 children: Tracy, twins Gunnar and Matthew, and youngest son Sam. At first, the Nelson household became the very image of a dream family. Friends who visited often recalled scenes that could have been lifted straight from an idyllic magazine spread. Ricky, guitar in hand, playing lullabies in the living room while Kristen looked on proudly, the children chasing one another through hallways filled with laughter. On the outside, it seemed picture perfect, but beneath the surface, cracks began to appear. Fame is rarely a stable foundation for marriage, and in Ricky's case, the demands of a relentless touring schedule placed enormous strain on his personal life. Nights away from home turned into weeks, weeks into months. Kristen, left to manage the household and raise 4 children largely on her own, began to feel the weight of absence, not just physical, but emotional. Ricky, for his part, struggled with the duality of being adored by millions on stage, yet misunderstood in his own home. Some biographers suggest that Ricky, who had grown up under the watchful eye of television cameras, never truly learned how to live a private life away from public expectation. He was charming, yes, but also introverted, sometimes aloof and deeply sensitive. Imagine, for a moment, the loneliness of a man who could step onto a stage and hear the screams of thousands, only to return to a hotel room where silence became deafening. That silence, for Ricky, was often filled with self-doubt. As the 1970s unfolded, tension between Ricky and Kristen escalated. Friends noticed arguments becoming more frequent, and the glossy image of the Nelson family began to fray. Kristen, herself raised in a famous household, was no stranger to the pressures of celebrity. But the combination of Ricky's career demands and the emotional distance between them proved difficult to endure. At times, Kristen sought comfort in her own circle of friends, while Ricky buried himself deeper into his music, sometimes escaping through late-night recording sessions that seemed more like therapy than work. There are stories, some whispered, others printed in bold headlines, of the couple's struggles spilling into public view. Rumors of infidelity, financial disagreements, and personal resentment swirled around them like relentless storms. Whether every detail was true or not mattered little. The damage to their marriage was undeniable. By 1982, after nearly 2 decades together, Ricky and Kristen divorced. For Ricky, the split was devastating. The man who had once been the poster child of youthful innocence was suddenly thrust into a new role, that of a single father, navigating heartbreak in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. While he remained devoted to his children, the collapse of his marriage left deep scars. Friends recall him appearing more withdrawn, even melancholic, as though a part of the light that once defined him had dimmed. Yet even in heartbreak, there were moments of resilience. Ricky continued to perform, pouring his emotions into his music. Fans who attended his concerts during this period often remarked that his performances carried a new kind of depth. Less polished, perhaps, but more raw, more real. It was as if he was no longer just singing to entertain, but to heal, both himself and those who listened. The story of Ricky Nelson's life had always been one of contrasts: public adoration and private heartbreak, chart-topping success and inner solitude. Yet nothing could have prepared the world for the shocking and tragic way his story would end. As the clock wound down on 1985, America was preparing to welcome a new year with fireworks, laughter, and hope. But for Ricky Nelson, that New Year's Eve would become the last chapter of a life written in both brilliance and sorrow. On the evening of December 31st, Ricky boarded a vintage Douglas DC-3 aircraft, accompanied by his fiancée, Helen Blair, and members of his band. The flight was meant to take them to Dallas for a New Year's Eve performance, a show that promised to be one of many in his effort to reignite a career that had seen its share of ups and downs. Friends later said Ricky was in good spirits that night. Some recalled him joking with his bandmates, talking excitedly about the year ahead, and even hinting that he was working on a new sound that might surprise his audience. For a man who had weathered divorce, shifting musical landscapes, and the fickleness of fame, the prospect of renewal seemed real. But destiny had other plans. Somewhere over DeKalb, Texas, just hours before midnight, the DC-3 caught fire midair. Witnesses on the ground described seeing the aircraft glowing against the night sky, flames trailing from its fuselage like a comet. Moments later, the plane descended, disappearing into the dark horizon before erupting into a fiery crash. When rescuers reached the wreckage, the scene was one of devastation. Ricky Nelson, Helen Blair, and 5 of his bandmates had perished inside the cabin. Miraculously, both pilots survived, having escaped through the cockpit before the inferno consumed the aircraft. For fans who woke to the news on New Year's Day, the shock was indescribable. A man whose voice had once defined youthful innocence was gone in a blaze of tragedy. Almost immediately, the questions began. How could such a thing happen? Why had Ricky chosen to fly in a plane that many considered outdated and unsafe? The DC-3, after all, was an aircraft model first built in the 1930s. Rumors swirled that Ricky had a sentimental attachment to the vintage craft, seeing it as a symbol of classic Americana, perhaps even a nod to his own nostalgic career. But was that attachment a fatal mistake? Theories spread like wildfire. Some tabloids suggested drug use might have sparked the onboard fire, painting lurid pictures of a rock star undone by excess. Others whispered of equipment failure, negligence, or even foul play. For a brief moment, Ricky's carefully guarded image was threatened, overshadowed by innuendo and scandal. Yet when the official autopsy and toxicology reports were released, they cleared him completely. No drugs, no alcohol, nothing to tarnish his name. Ricky Nelson, the boy next-door idol of the 1950s, had died clean, his reputation intact. And still the mystery deepened. The pilots insisted that smoke had filled the cabin shortly before the crash, but the exact cause of the fire remained uncertain. Investigators concluded it was likely due to a faulty cabin heater, though skeptics were never fully convinced. Some wondered aloud, if the pilots had survived, why had no one else been able to escape? Could the fire have been more sudden, more violent than reported? Adding to the intrigue were the haunting coincidences. In the weeks before his death, Ricky had reportedly spoken to friends about feeling restless and ready for something new. One close acquaintance recalled a strange comment Ricky made after a performance. "Sometimes I think I've lived 2 lives already, and the third is waiting for me just beyond the horizon." Was it mere poetic reflection or an eerie premonition? For years, Ricky Nelson's death remained a wound wrapped in mystery, an open question that seemed to resist closure. Fans clung to rumors, journalists chased theories, and the Nelson family endured endless speculation. But as the decades passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. And when the truth finally emerged, it was not the romantic tragedy that fans might have wished for. It was something colder, harsher, a story of neglect, mismanagement, and fatal oversight. Investigators who revisited the case years later uncovered what had long been whispered in aviation circles. The DC-3 that carried Ricky on that fateful New Year's Eve flight should never have been in the air at all. The plane was a relic, a survivor of a bygone era. Built in the 1940s, it had been patched and repurposed so many times that some mechanics privately called it a Frankenstein aircraft. Its beauty lay in nostalgia, not reliability. Ricky, enamored with the vintage look and the romance of flying in a classic plane, reportedly loved the DC-3. But what he may not have realized, or perhaps chose to overlook, was that the aircraft was more museum piece than machine of the future. Central to the disaster was the heating system. Records later showed that it had malfunctioned multiple times in the years leading up to the crash. Instead of replacing it according to strict safety standards, the heater had been repeatedly repaired with makeshift fixes, each one more dangerous than the last. Engineers who studied the wreckage years later described it as a ticking time bomb, sitting just beneath the cabin floor, close to upholstery and paneling made from materials that were notoriously flammable. On the night of December 31st, 1985, that time bomb went off. Passengers may have first noticed the acrid smell of burning insulation, perhaps thinking it was nothing more than turbulence or a minor mechanical issue. But within minutes, smoke began to fill the cabin. The heater had ignited, flames spreading rapidly across the cabin walls. The old DC-3 had no modern fire suppression system, no flame-retardant linings, no automatic alarms. And worse still, there were no onboard fire extinguishers within reach of the passengers. Imagine the terror in those final moments. Ricky and his companions choking on black smoke, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. The fire spread faster than anyone could react, consuming oxygen and flooding the cabin with toxic fumes. Experts later determined that most of the passengers were overcome by smoke inhalation long before the aircraft struck the ground. In other words, Ricky Nelson and his bandmates died not from the impact of a crash, but from being trapped in a metal coffin filled with poison. The cruelest detail of all was that the pilots survived. Protected by the cockpit's sealed doors, they had a separate emergency exit, something the passengers in the back were never afforded. They scrambled out moments before the plane erupted into a final inferno. To the families of those who perished, this grim irony was unbearable. 2 men lived because of design privilege, while Ricky, Helen Blair, and the band had no chance at all. In the years that followed, lawsuits and investigations piled up. Aviation experts condemned the aircraft's maintenance as negligent, bordering on reckless. Some pointed fingers at the plane's owners, accusing them of valuing cost savings over human lives. Others faulted a broader culture of complacency in parts of the aviation industry during the 1980s, when vintage aircraft were sometimes operated with little regard for modern safety standards. And so the narrative shifted. Ricky Nelson's death was no longer seen as a tragic twist of fate or an unexplainable mystery. It was revealed for what it truly was: an avoidable disaster, born of carelessness and systemic failure. The haunting mystery gave way to a bitter truth. Ricky had not been betrayed by destiny, but by negligence. For fans, this revelation was devastating in a different way. Many had preferred the myth, the idea of a tragic star taken too soon by fate's cruel hand. That version of the story, though heartbreaking, carried a certain poetic weight. The truth, however, was far less romantic. Their idol had been killed by something as mundane as poor maintenance and corporate irresponsibility. There was no poetry in it, only anger and grief. Yet perhaps this raw, uncomfortable truth deepened Ricky Nelson's legacy in its own way. His death became a cautionary tale about the costs of complacency and the fragility of life, no matter how famous or beloved. Aviation regulations were quietly revisited, with stricter attention to maintenance records for older planes. Fans, meanwhile, transformed their mourning into advocacy, insisting that his death not be dismissed as mere bad luck. What if Ricky had chosen another plane that night? What if the heater had been properly replaced years earlier? What if, instead of nostalgia, practicality had guided his decision-making? Each question lingers like smoke from a long-extinguished fire, reminders of the tiny, preventable decisions that led to one of music's greatest losses. In the end, Ricky Nelson's passing was not an unsolvable riddle, but a sobering example of how greatness can be undone by negligence. He did not fall because of scandal, nor did he succumb to the excesses that destroyed so many of his contemporaries. Instead, he was betrayed by a system that failed to protect him, by the careless choices of others. That knowledge has only made the loss more bitter. For fans who still play Travelin' Man or Poor Little Fool, the music remains timeless, but the silence after the song ends carries the weight of an ugly truth. Ricky Nelson's life was one of beauty, but his death was one of injustice. And that perhaps is the hardest legacy of all to accept. Today, when people talk about Ricky Nelson, they not only remember a talented singer, a star of the rock and roll era, but also remember a tragic death that could have been completely avoided. That tragedy is a reminder of the price to pay for negligence and greed. It is also a wake-up call about aviation safety, about the responsibility to protect human life, no matter who it is. Perhaps Ricky Nelson will always be an icon, not only because of his immortal music, but also because of the tearful story behind his unjust death. And when the truth has been revealed, what we can do is to continue to cherish his legacy and not let that tragedy fall into oblivion.